On the morning of the 1st of May, 1945, beneath the ruined streets of Berlin, a war that had already been decided continued to burn. Above ground, the German capital was a landscape of shattered buildings, collapsing walls, and streets filled with smoke. Soviet artillery thundered through the city, the sound echoing between damaged apartment blocks and government buildings that had once represented the power of the Third Reich. Inside the Führerbunker, deep beneath the gardens of the Reich Chancellery, the man who had led Germany into catastrophe was already dead. Adolf Hitler had taken his own life the previous afternoon. His body had been carried outside, burned according to his instructions, and hidden among the ruins of the place where he had spent his final days. The political leadership that remained knew the reality. Germany had lost. Berlin was surrounded. The armies that Hitler had commanded existed mostly as broken formations scattered across Europe. The Allies controlled the skies, the Soviet Union was advancing from the east, and millions of German civilians were trapped between collapsing front lines. Yet across the remaining German military forces, the fighting continued. Thousands of soldiers still manned defensive positions. Tanks moved through ruined roads. Artillery crews fired at advancing Allied troops. Aircraft, where fuel and functioning machines remained, continued to fly. In some places, German units surrendered quickly. In others, they fought until their ammunition was gone. To those watching from outside Germany, the question seemed almost impossible to understand. Why would soldiers continue fighting after the death of the leader who had demanded their absolute obedience? Why continue when defeat was no longer a possibility but a certainty? Why sacrifice more lives for a regime that was already collapsing? The answer was not a single moment, a single order, or a single belief. It was the result of years of military culture, fear, propaganda, discipline, personal loyalty, confusion, and the desperate circumstances of a nation collapsing under the weight of its own war. For many German soldiers, the final days of the Second World War were not experienced as a clear historical ending. They were experienced as chaos. Communications failed. Orders contradicted reality. Units became isolated from their commanders. Some soldiers did not even know Hitler was dead. Others knew but believed surrender would bring punishment, imprisonment, or death. Across the final battlefields of Europe, German troops faced an impossible choice: continue fighting for a lost cause, or surrender to enemies they had been taught for years to fear. The decisions made during those final days would determine not only who survived the war, but also how history would remember the final soldiers of Nazi Germany. Because Hitler's death did not immediately end the German military machine. The war continued because the system he had created had been built to continue fighting, even when victory had become impossible. For much of the Second World War, the German armed forces, known as the Wehrmacht, had been one of the most powerful military organizations in the world. Its early victories had created an image of unstoppable strength. Poland fell in weeks. France collapsed in 1940. German forces advanced deep into the Soviet Union. Millions of soldiers fought across a front stretching thousands of kilometers. But by 1945, that image had disappeared. The German army was no longer the force that had crossed Europe during the first years of the war. It was exhausted, depleted, and increasingly dependent on younger recruits, older men, and poorly trained replacements. The Eastern Front had consumed enormous numbers of German soldiers. Battles such as Stalingrad, Kursk, and the Soviet offensives of 1944 had destroyed entire armies. By the beginning of 1945, Germany was fighting a defensive war on every front. In the West, American, British, Canadian, and French forces had crossed into Germany after the Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944. In the East, Soviet armies pushed relentlessly towards Berlin after years of devastating warfare. German cities had suffered enormous bombing campaigns, industrial production was collapsing, and millions of civilians were displaced. The military situation had become desperate. Yet within the German command structure, Surrender was often treated not as a practical decision, but as betrayal. The origins of this attitude stretched back years. After taking power in 1933, Hitler transformed Germany's military system and demanded personal loyalty from its soldiers. In 1934, after the death of President Paul von Hindenburg, members of the armed forces were required to swear a personal oath of allegiance to Hitler himself rather than simply to the German state. This oath became deeply significant. Many soldiers viewed their duty through the traditional military idea of obedience. Orders were followed because obedience was considered the foundation of military discipline. Even when the strategic situation deteriorated, many continued believing that their responsibility was to obey their commanders rather than question political decisions. However, loyalty alone does not explain why so many fought until the very end. Fear played an equally powerful role. By 1945, German soldiers had seen what happened to defeated armies. Millions of German prisoners had been captured on the Eastern Front, and reports of harsh treatment circulated among the troops. Some fears were based on genuine experiences, while others were intensified by Nazi propaganda designed to convince soldiers that surrender to the Soviet Union would lead to destruction. The Nazi leadership deliberately encouraged these fears. Throughout the final months of the war, propaganda portrayed the advancing Soviet forces as a threat not only to the German military, but to German society itself. Soldiers were told that continuing resistance was necessary to protect their families and communities. At the same time, many commanders understood that the war was lost. Some attempted to surrender their units, others negotiated local ceasefires. But in many areas, the chain of command remained committed to continued resistance because Hitler's orders demanded it, because they feared punishment, or because they believed holding out might improve Germany's final position. The result was a military still fighting after its political leadership had collapsed. The final battles of the Second World War were therefore not simply a continuation of Hitler's personal commands. They were the consequence of a system that had spent 12 years creating obedience, fear, and the belief that surrender was unacceptable. And as German soldiers prepared for what would become the final days of the European war, many found themselves trapped between two realities. One was the reality around them: destroyed cities, empty roads, abandoned equipment, and advancing enemy armies. The other was the reality they had been taught to believe: that sacrifice, resistance, and loyalty could still somehow change the outcome. Between those two worlds, thousands continued to fight, and the reasons why would reveal one of the most complicated endings in military history. The final weeks of the war created a situation unlike any Germany had faced before. The normal structures of command were breaking apart, yet the expectation of obedience remained. Officers who had spent years operating within a rigid military hierarchy now faced a battlefield where the orders arriving from above often had little connection to reality. Hitler's headquarters continued issuing commands for armies that barely existed. On paper, divisions were ordered to counterattack. Armored formations were instructed to move into positions despite having few functioning tanks. Units were told to hold towns and bridges that had already been surrounded. The language of military operations continued, but the physical ability to carry out those operations had almost disappeared. This disconnect became one of the defining characteristics of Germany's final battles. The German military system had always placed enormous importance on discipline and command structure. A soldier was expected to carry out orders even under extreme conditions. During the early victories of the war, this discipline had contributed to operational success. German units were often able to coordinate rapid movements and maintain effectiveness under pressure. But in 1945, the same culture that had helped create battlefield efficiency also made it difficult for many soldiers to recognize when continued resistance had become meaningless. Some commanders did make the decision to surrender. Across Germany and Austria, officers negotiated with Allied forces, attempting to save the lives of their remaining troops and civilians. On the Western Front, Several German units surrendered before the final collapse. Many soldiers understood that capture by American or British forces offered a better chance of survival than continued fighting. But on the Eastern Front, the situation was different. For many German soldiers, surrender to the Soviet Union represented an unknown and terrifying future. The Eastern Front had been the most brutal theater of the entire war. Both sides had committed enormous violence, and German troops had participated in a war of annihilation that had caused unimaginable suffering across Eastern Europe. By 1945, German soldiers knew that the Soviet advance was not simply a conventional military operation. They had witnessed the destruction of entire regions, the collapse of communities, and the consequences of a conflict fought with extraordinary hatred. Many soldiers feared what would happen when the Red Army reached them. Nazi propaganda had repeatedly warned that Soviet victory would mean revenge against Germany. These warnings were deliberately exaggerated and used to maintain resistance, but they were also reinforced by genuine experiences from the battlefield. Reports of violence against civilians and prisoners circulated among German troops, creating panic among soldiers who believed surrender might bring terrible consequences. For some, continuing to fight was not about winning. It was about delaying the moment of capture. The same was true for many civilians. As Soviet forces approached Berlin, millions of Germans attempted to move westward, hoping to surrender to American or British forces instead. Roads became crowded with refugees, military vehicles, wounded soldiers, and families carrying whatever possessions they could save. The collapse of Germany was not a single event. It was a slow disintegration, experienced differently by millions of people. For soldiers, the final days often meant exhaustion, hunger, and uncertainty. Many had been fighting for years. Some had lost friends and family members. Others had never known anything except war. Young recruits were still being sent into combat. In the final months, Germany relied increasingly on inexperienced soldiers. Some were teenagers from the Hitler Youth who had received only limited training before being armed and placed in defensive positions. Others were older men who had previously been considered too old for frontline service. The desperation was clear. The German army that had once launched major offensives across Europe was now defending streets, villages, and bridges with whatever manpower remained. One of the most famous examples was the Battle of Berlin. By late April 1945, Soviet forces had surrounded the city. The German defenders included regular army units, Waffen-SS formations, police units, foreign volunteers, and members of the Volkssturm, a national militia created in the final months of the war. Their equipment varied dramatically. Some had modern weapons, others carried outdated rifles. Some had anti-tank weapons capable of destroying Soviet armored vehicles, while others had almost no military value. Yet they fought. The streets of Berlin became a battlefield unlike any other in the European war. Soviet tanks moved through destroyed neighborhoods, while German defenders fired from buildings, underground stations, and improvised positions. The fighting was extremely close. There were no clear front lines. A building controlled by one side in the morning could be occupied by the other side by evening. Civilians hid in basements while soldiers fought above them. The psychological pressure was immense. German soldiers knew the war was ending, but many continued because surrender seemed impossible. Some feared Soviet captivity. Some feared punishment for their involvement with the Nazi regime. Some believed they were protecting their families by delaying the fighting. Others simply followed the orders given to them. This final resistance reached its symbolic end inside the Führerbunker. After Hitler's death on April 30, 1945, his successor, Admiral Karl Dönitz, attempted to create a new government. Dönitz understood that Germany could no longer win the war. His primary objective was to surrender to the Western Allies, while preventing as many German soldiers and civilians as possible from falling into Soviet hands. The surrender process therefore happened in stages. German forces did not surrender all at once. On May 4, 1945, German forces in the Netherlands, Denmark, and northwest Germany surrendered to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. On May 7th, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German armed forces at Allied headquarters in Reims, France. A second signing took place in Berlin on May 8th, with the Soviet Union represented. This date became known as Victory in Europe Day. But even then, fighting continued in some areas. Communications had collapsed. Some units did not immediately receive surrender orders. Others refused to believe them or chose to continue fighting. In parts of Czechoslovakia, Austria, and other regions, German troops remained engaged in combat after the official surrender had been signed. The war ended through paperwork before it ended on every battlefield, and behind those final shots were thousands of individual decisions. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable true stories like this to the channel. The question of why German soldiers continued fighting after Hitler's death is closely connected to a broader comparison with other armies facing defeat during the Second World War. Germany was not the only nation whose soldiers continued fighting after victory had become unlikely. Japan, for example, continued resisting after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet declaration of war in August 1945. Japanese military culture placed enormous importance on honor, duty, and resistance against surrender. Like Germany, Japan's soldiers often viewed surrender as unacceptable. However, the reasons were different. The Japanese military system was built around concepts of honor and sacrifice associated with the emperor and national identity. The German military's final resistance was more closely connected to political loyalty, fear of occupation, command obedience, and the consequences of Nazi ideology. The Soviet Union also provides a different comparison. During the German invasion of 1941, Soviet soldiers continued fighting despite catastrophic losses. Millions were killed or captured during the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. Soviet resistance was driven by a combination of patriotism, fear of German occupation, political pressure, and determination to defend their homeland. The difference was that the Soviet Union still had strategic depth, industrial capacity, and manpower. Germany in 1945 had none of these advantages. Its remaining forces faced overwhelming numerical and material superiority. The Allies possessed enormous resources. The United States alone produced tens of thousands of aircraft, tanks, and vehicles during the war. Britain maintained a vast industrial and scientific effort, while the Soviet Union relocated factories eastward and produced enormous numbers of tanks and artillery pieces despite suffering catastrophic destruction. German equipment was often technically advanced, but production could not match Allied quantity. The Panther tank, for example, was one of the most powerful medium tanks of the war, with excellent armor protection and a high-velocity 75mm gun. However, it was complex to manufacture and suffered reliability problems, especially in early versions. The Soviet T-34 was less sophisticated but easier to produce in large numbers. More than 57,000 T-34 tanks were manufactured during the war, creating a scale that Germany could not match. The same pattern appeared across the battlefield. German aircraft designs such as the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter represented technological innovation, but fuel shortages, production difficulties, and Allied air superiority limited their impact. By 1945, Germany was no longer fighting a war of maneuver and conquest. It was fighting a war of survival, and survival had become impossible. By the spring of 1945, the German military machine that had once dominated much of Europe had become something very different. The armies that had crossed borders with confidence only a few years earlier were now scattered remnants defending a collapsing state. The final battles were not fought because victory remained within reach. They were fought because millions of soldiers were trapped inside a system that had taught them obedience, sacrifice, and resistance until the very end. The immediate impact of this continued fighting was devastating. Every additional day of combat meant more deaths among soldiers and civilians. Cities that had already suffered years of bombing and destruction were further damaged. Roads, bridges, and communities were destroyed during battles that could no longer change the outcome of the war. The final weeks of the conflict also created enormous humanitarian suffering. Across Central Europe, civilians attempted to escape the advancing armies. Families were separated. Millions became refugees. Prisoners of war filled camps across the continent. The collapse of Nazi Germany created one of the largest population movements in European history. For German soldiers who survived, the end of the war marked the beginning of another difficult chapter. Millions became prisoners of war. Some returned home within months, while others remained in captivity for years. Their experiences varied greatly, depending on where they surrendered and which Allied forces captured them. The war also forced Germany and the world to confront the crimes committed by the Nazi regime. The defeat of Hitler's Germany was not simply the end of a military conflict. It was the end of a dictatorship responsible for the Holocaust, a war of aggression across Europe, and the deaths of millions of civilians and prisoners. After the war, the German military tradition itself came under examination. The question was not only why soldiers had fought, but how an entire military organization had been used by a criminal political system. Historians have spent decades studying the relationship between obedience and responsibility, examining where military duty ended and personal accountability began. The story of German soldiers continuing to fight after Hitler's death therefore became part of a much larger historical question. How do ordinary people behave when institutions collapse? How long can loyalty survive after reality has changed? And at what point does following orders become participation in destruction? Historians continue to debate these questions because the final days of Nazi Germany were not simple. Not every German soldier was motivated by the same beliefs. Some were committed Nazis, some were afraid. Some wanted only to survive. Some rejected Hitler's ideology, but continued fighting because of military obligation or fear of punishment. The evidence shows a complex picture. There was fanaticism, but there was also confusion. There was loyalty, but there was also coercion. There was determination, but there was also desperation. The end of the war also influenced future military thinking. After 1945, many nations examined the dangers of unquestioning obedience within armed forces. Military organizations around the world placed greater emphasis on lawful orders, individual responsibility, and the limits of command authority. The German experience became one of the most studied examples of how a professional military could be drawn into the service of an aggressive dictatorship. Today, reminders of those final days remain. Museums preserve surviving vehicles, weapons, uniforms, documents, and personal accounts from the conflict. Archives across Europe contain millions of pages recording orders, reports, letters, and testimonies from soldiers and civilians who experienced the collapse firsthand. Places such as the remains of the Führerbunker in Berlin, the battlefields of the Eastern Front, and former military sites across Germany serve as physical reminders of how quickly power can disappear. The ruins tell a story. They show that even the most powerful regimes can collapse. They show that technology, armies, and weapons cannot overcome strategic reality forever. And they show that history is ultimately shaped not only by leaders and generals, but by the choices made by individuals caught inside events far larger than themselves. On the morning of May 1st, 1945, the world beneath Berlin was already changing. The man whose voice had commanded millions was gone. The empire he promised would last for 1,000 years existed only as smoke rising above the ruins of the Reich Chancellery. Yet above those ruins, soldiers were still fighting. Some did not know the truth. Some refused to accept it. Some believed they had no other choice. Others understood that the war was lost, but continued because years of discipline and fear had left them unable to imagine another path. Their weapons fired not because victory was possible, but because surrender had become unthinkable. That was the tragedy of Germany's final soldiers. They were not fighting at the height of power. They were fighting among the remains of a shattered nation. The tanks moving through destroyed streets were not the symbols of conquest they had once been. They were the last echoes of a conflict that had consumed an entire continent. The artillery shells fired in those final hours did not change the course of history. They only added more names to the millions already lost. When Hitler died, the war did not immediately end because wars are not controlled by one person alone. They continue through systems, through commands, through beliefs, and through the decisions of those caught within them. The final German soldiers of the Second World War stood at the end of an impossible road. Behind them was a regime built on aggression and destruction. Ahead of them was an uncertain future shaped by defeat and accountability. Between those two realities, they fought until the moment when resistance finally became impossible. Their story is not a story of victory. It is not a story of heroic last stands. It is a story of collapse. A story of how obedience, fear, and ideology can continue pushing people forward even after the destination has disappeared. The ruins of 1945 remind us that wars rarely end when the last order is given. They end when the human cost becomes impossible to ignore. And in the final days of Nazi Germany, as the guns fell silent across Europe, the world was left with a lasting lesson. The greatest battles in history are not only fought between armies, but within the choices of those who stand among them.